So I have a question. Do you like when the hero loses control and they turn into something else entirely? Because I do. I absolutely love this idea. One of my favorites. Because there's so much that you can do with it. So many ways that you can write it, emphasize it, to take a hero through this journey and process to break them and have them turn into something else entirely because of it. The three characters that we're going to be looking at today is from one author, two different stories. The first, Kaneki from Tokyo Ghoul, and the second is Tokio and Azuma from Choujin X. These are the characters of Sue Ishida, and if you know how he writes, what he likes to do, what he likes to put his characters through, you know this is his forte. This is his very, very unforgiving style. I think before you even start to write your idea about having your hero lose control, you need to make them fragile. You need to make them soft. And there's a lot of ways that you can go about this. You don't have to make them meek or pathetic, but you need to give them emotional texture. You need to give them emotional weight and depth. And Sue Ishida is a masterclass at doing this. All of his characters have this beautiful texture behind them when it comes to their emotional complexities. How they view themselves, how they view the world, how they view other people around them, how they interact, how that changes and shapes up and morphs into this weird homogeneous pot of what they may think about themselves and how other people think about them. And realistically, you can take the idea of being fragile so many different places, but for Ishida, it's usually very internal. He likes his characters to be problematic, and not in the sense where they're evil or corruptive or difficult, but problematic in the sense of uneasy. You can never comfortably put your finger on what this character is or what they represent or how they actually feel or how they react to certain things or how they will even grow. I say problematic because usually his characters are faced with problematic things, which in turn provides an inner conflict. All of his characters tend to have inner conflicts, the scale of which varies drastically. A character like Kaneki, I think, is a perfect example. Someone genuinely fragile and soft, has a beautiful emotional starting point, and then basically throwing him into the deep end of death and depression and this whole new world that he can't escape from. Imagine that for a moment. You're living your everyday life, you're a fine functioning human being, and now you're an abomination. Half human, half ghoul, can't fit into either world. The humans don't want you, the ghouls don't want you, and now you're witnessing death. Not to mention you can't eat human food. You throw it up, and now you can only be cannibal. And you see that reaction through Kaneki heavily. It's one of the biggest tumultuous points of the story, and his character is him coming to understand that. Him not only understanding the world that he's now a part of and trying to very forcefully and slowly integrate within, but also internally trying to understand what he is or who he is. And it's that emotional tether that binds everything together that provides a fragile experience. Something that can, yes, be reinforced, strengthened, boldened, which you will see, but something that can also be teared down to its roots, to its core. And it's remembering where they come from, where they started, that is important. Because when they eventually break, when they spiral out of control, it's because of those emotional tethers all the way from the beginning. Tokio and Azuma from Choujin X, his other main characters, I find are kind of like remastered versions of Kaneki, not as drastically thrown into the world emotionally, but still powerful. These two boys are best friends, but they're also night and day. Tokio is genuinely meek. He's kind of shy and by himself, someone that you would typically view as being a loner. And then Azuma, the only friend that he has, is like this bright and powerful individual that feels like he's not scared of anything. So these two together, night and day, work beautifully, but internally they have a very odd conflict, and it becomes the root of Choujin X's story. So you don't always have to make your characters fragile in the sense of them being sad or a loner or depressive. Tokio and Azuma are kind of the opposite to Kaneki in a way where, yes, Tokio is kind of shy and a bit of a loner, but he takes a lot of examples from Azuma. He actually wants to do better, and Azuma is the furthest away from Kaneki. So this is where the other side of being fragile comes in, having a soft spot. Azuma and Tokio are soft for each other. They're best friends. They're all they've ever known. Their environment has molded them to kind of rely on each other very, very heavily. But again, that's where the issue arises. The conflict that is born. Sue Ishida has a signature style when it comes to pushing his characters out of control. Not only does he have the being human, fragile, fragility side of it, but he also implements power. The actual power that these characters have. And you might think that's normal, but he genuinely takes it a couple of steps further. See, the powers that he has in all of his stories actually mean something. They represent something. They're not just a fire ability or a gravity ability or this or that. A lot of the time, they're usually internalized. So you could get a fire ability, but it might be because you're an angry individual. On the other hand, you could get a gravity ability, but it might be because internally you're unbalanced. I love when he does this because it leads perfectly into the explosion, the breaking point. It makes sense that your character emotionally would get so worked up because of whatever reason that they hit their limit, and because their power is entwined to them emotionally, it grows alongside. So when they emotionally hit their limit, their power also hits their limit, and then they just freak out. Winding those two together, I think, is Sue Ishida's signature style. I can't think of any author that does it as consistently or as commonly or as complex per se to what Ishida does. And that's not a knock on other stories, but again, to emphasize just how much of this is Ishida's style, what he likes to write. In Kaneki's case, you see that power directly and how it's implemented into the mind and emotions. You have a thing called half kakuja. This is when you kind of reach your breaking point for the first time, but you are out of control. You are emotionally a mess. Your mind is scrambled. You have no semblance of understanding of the world, so you transform into a hideous monstrosity. However, if you're able to survive this, if you're able to control this, if you're able to potentially master this, you can have a full kakuja. That's the final stage of a kakuja, you mentally and emotionally being in control over all of your abilities. But even just the visual depiction, the representation of Kaneki's centipede comes from a traumatizing experience. So his ability, quite literally in design, is a reflection of his trauma. I love that. It's very powerful because when you see him conquer his ability and learn to control it and utilize it in so many different ways, you know that he's conquering his trauma. He's healing it. He's aiding it a little bit. That doesn't mean it just disappears or vanishes. It's still problematic, but it provides a beautiful sense of growth. This is just a simplified version of all of the experiences that Kaneki has gone through, all of the different representations that his abilities have, the different minds that he goes through, the different changes in his emotional structure, going from Kaneki to Hayase, very different, very drastic, but they all eventually come together in their different ways. Choujin X powers work a little bit differently, but have similarities, and their powers are usually in some way representative to the individual's personality. How Tokio and Azuma do it is through an injection, but it's because they're being attacked by something. So they decide within the moment that they will both inject each other, but only one of them gets powers, and that's Tokio. How do you think Azuma would react to that? His best friend getting a power? He'd be happy for him, right? He'd be grateful that he saved their lives, and it's not that simple. Azuma has a lot of pride. He likes when people rely on him, but when people step away, when people scale higher than him, when people don't necessarily need him, he gets a bit weird, and a jealousy, a rift starts to crack between them. Just maybe what he was injected with is a little bit of a late bloomer. Tokio and Azuma reach their breaking point through constant death. It's a little bit weird to explain, but every time they have a critical injury, they have the opportunity to what we call raise, quite literally raising from the dead. But there's only a certain amount of times that you can do this before you start losing control. For some people it might be twice, for others 5 to 10 times. It is entirely dependent of your understanding of your own power, emotionally, mentally, and physically. So when these two lose control for the first time, they turn into something that you couldn't even imagine. Hardly even a reflection of their abilities, and that's because there's actually more to it, for them at least. What they turn into, what they become when they reach their limit, it's not just because of their power. So this obviously is the most critical moment, right? What you've been waiting for the whole time throughout the story. When is my character, my hero, going to lose control? What is that going to look like? Ishida does a really great job in emphasizing these moments. He makes them feel powerful, but also tragic, depressing, but conflicted, simply heart-wrenching. Every time you see these characters reach their breaking point, you too, emotionally, are probably reaching your breaking point as well. Sitting there crying and screaming, hoping that your character is going to come out alive, because at the end of the day, you don't actually know. Ishida's very sneaky like that. These characters go far past their breaking point. They don't just blow up and start breaking some walls, they become things that you would have never expected. He loves to do this, and the more build up and the more emphasis that goes into that moment, obviously the bigger the payoff. Funny enough, every time he does it, however, it's always pushed emotionally first. Sure, you could do it power-wise, like someone losing control of their power, but that's just not what he does. Instead, he wants to have his heroes lose themselves emotionally, almost like they've been hanging on so desperately to some semblance of normality, but everything starts to slip away. And as soon as it starts to slip away, that's when the cracks appear. When those cracks appear, that's when everything loses control. That's when the power comes out. And that's a very big difference. Having your characters lose emotionally first compared to power. There's a handful of examples of Kaneki doing this, the first being his half kakuja form with Hide, but the one I want to focus on is right at the end of the story. He loses a fight that you don't even get to witness, but it's a very desperate one. You see, he needed to win this fight. His friends' lives were on the line. His wife, his baby was on the line. When he lost, he retreated internally, and you have this beautiful moment where he's talking to every aspect of himself, every iteration that Kaneki has gone through. What do you think the outcome would be? Utter destruction and despair? Kind of, yeah. What sets him over the edge is that he would never be able to see Tokio again. He just got married. He just found out he's having a child. That is what sends him into a spiral. And when I say a spiral, I mean for the first time in the story, we're going past a half kakuja, full kakuja. We're going into a form that we've never really seen, a monstrosity. They call it dragon. It's this massive serpent, huge abomination of a creature where Kaneki is just no longer there. He just becomes this creature that's fully out of control. It's like the size of a skyscraper. He's gone and lost within there. That one panel, the breaking point, lives in my head rent-free. Just seeing everything that comes from the dragon arc, the lead up to that breaking point is superb. Azuma and Tokio, on the other hand, they go through something a little bit different. See, they have stages to their breaking point. By this point, Tokio has been using his abilities and Azuma is still unknown. We don't know what his ability is. He hasn't awakened yet. While Tokio is being hunted down, the person he's with, him and a couple other people, are basically on death's door. And Azuma sees this. He runs in being his human self and he gets obliterated. He gets killed, basically. But it's showing that weakness, that he's always been so strong and everyone's always relied on him and that he's always saved people. The hero of the story sucks, gets beat down, gets belittled, and that is what sends him over the edge. So his awakening, he turns into this faceless caped crusader. They call him the Moon Beast, which beautiful name by the way, and he just becomes someone unknown. This is not a normal transformation by the way. When you awaken for the first time, you're not out of control, but perhaps because Azuma raised from death and because his mind was working overtime to try and figure out his ability, he couldn't recognize himself. So he is a faceless being. And he is fast and scary and absolutely crazy. And after obliterating the enemies that were there, Tokio tries to stop him, tries to calm him down, and then they fight. And for the first time, Tokio starts to lose control because this is a conflict between best friends, but now they're emotionally starting to connect and understand why they have this conflict with each other, why Azuma feels so weirdly towards Tokio to begin with. This jealousy starts to come out to play. And then Tokio, because he's getting heavily injured, is so confused and really hates that he's fighting his best friend, and he starts to lose control. And then Tokio turns into something else. This eyeless, godly figure. It's incredibly powerful. Instantly wipes out Azuma. And it's funny enough, within that loss, you see Azuma cry for the first time. You see him break down even after his breaking point. Tokio doesn't really remember what happens or how he even got to that point to begin with, but as a reader, you can understand perfectly why they reached that point. why they both reached their limits. Look, I love how Ishida writes. I love how he handles his heroes. I love when he makes them lose control. It's arguably the funnest thing that he does in his stories. It's depressing and heartbreaking, don't get me wrong, but just so incredibly powerful. For me personally, no other author does it like him. When it comes to his characters, when it comes to his heroes, even when it comes to his villains, he has such a magnificent understanding of how to bring so much life and character and texture to his creations. And you gotta love him for it.